Desperate single mother gives her final dollar to a stranger, but years later, he shows up at her door with a request she could never have imagined. Annabeth walked briskly, her worn sneakers slapping against the cracked pavement as she clutched her coat tighter. The city seemed colder than usual today, or maybe it was just her mood. She had spent the morning going from one job interview to another, each rejection blending into the next. Her thoughts raced with worries. Rent was overdue, her son's school fees were looming, and the fridge was nearly empty. As the sun dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows over the streets, she felt a gnawing sense of hopelessness. It was then that she noticed him again. Jack. She had seen him before, sitting at the same corner with that battered cardboard sign. Hungry. Anything helps. His shaggy hair hung over his gaunt face, and his eyes, once lively, now seemed hollow, almost as if they had forgotten what hope looked like. Annabeth hesitated for a moment. She didn't have much, hardly enough for herself, let alone to share. But there was something in his gaze that tugged at her, a reflection of the desperation she knew all too well. Reaching into her purse, she felt the single, crumpled dollar bill between her fingers. It was her last one, the only cash she had until who knew when. For a moment, she thought of keeping it, of turning her head and walking past him. But something stopped her. Her hand acted on its own, pulling out the dollar and offering it to him. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps. His fingers brushed hers as he took the bill, and a soft, surprised "thank you" slipped from his lips. Annabeth managed a small smile, though it barely touched her eyes. "Take care," she whispered before turning away, the weight of her problems pressing down harder with every step she took. She didn't look back, and in truth, she didn't expect to ever see him again. Her act of kindness felt insignificant, like a drop of water in an endless sea of hardship. It wasn't going to fix anything for him or for her, but maybe, just maybe, it would bring a sliver of warmth to his otherwise cold world. As she continued her walk home, the streets felt emptier than before, each step echoing the loneliness of her own thoughts. She thought of her son, waiting for her back in their small apartment, probably hungry and wondering when dinner would be served. She'd have to get creative again, maybe stretch the last few groceries a little further, mix some canned beans with pasta. The thought of facing him with empty hands, without any good news, made her chest tighten. Still, a strange sense of calm settled over her as she walked. It wasn't much, just $1, a single act, but it was something. She had chosen to help, even when she had nothing to give, and somehow that choice, though small, felt significant. Her mind wandered as the city lights flickered on, wondering if Jack would find a meal tonight or if he too would feel the bitter sting of hunger. She hoped with all her heart that he would. The night fell quickly, and by the time Annabeth reached her apartment, the sky was a deep shade of blue, sprinkled with stars that barely peeked through the light pollution. She unlocked the door, her heart heavy, but her spirit strangely light. In the silence of her dimly lit living room, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, leaning against the doorframe and closing her eyes. $1. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She could only hope that small kindness would ripple outward, affecting lives in ways she couldn't yet foresee. The years had not been kind to Annabeth. What little stability she had clung to unraveled, thread by thread. Losing her second job felt like a punch to the gut. She had already been barely holding things together, and now the weight of her world grew heavier. The bills arrived faster than she could handle, each one more demanding than the last. At night, they taunted her, stacked high on the kitchen table, reminders of everything she couldn't fix. Annabeth's house, the small place she had worked so hard to keep, was slipping away from her. Foreclosure notices came in cold, formal language, as if the walls she had once painted and the floors her son had learned to crawl on were just another line in someone's paperwork. Her days blurred into an exhausting routine. Mornings meant job searches, Afternoons were filled with scrambling to make ends meet, and evenings were spent picking up any odd job she could find, cleaning houses, babysitting, doing the errands no one else wanted to do. But no matter how many hours she worked, it wasn't enough. The walls of her life were closing in, and she could feel it in her chest every time she took a breath. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused, and her eyes, once bright, carried the dull weight of constant worry. When the eviction finally came, it wasn't unexpected. Annabeth stood in her living room, looking at the cardboard boxes stacked around her, a silent testament to everything she had built and lost. She had hoped Tommy wouldn't notice, but he was too smart for that. He was growing up too fast, and the joy she used to see in his face had dimmed, replaced by the questions she couldn't answer. He had been a light in her life, but even that light seemed to flicker in the face of the reality they were now living in. The move to the cramped, temporary housing felt like a physical blow. The small apartment was nothing like the home they had once shared. The walls were thin, and the air smelled of dampness and stale cigarette smoke from the neighbors next door. There was no space for Tommy to play, no yard where he could run freely. He didn't complain, but his silence spoke volumes. Annabeth could see the worry etched in his young face, the way he held back his questions. She knew he was afraid, though he tried to be brave for her sake. Each night, when Tommy had finally fallen asleep on the worn mattress they shared, Annabeth would lie awake, staring at the ceiling. The darkness was suffocating, and her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't quiet. The image of Jack, the homeless man she had given her last dollar to years ago, would flash in her mind. She wondered what had become of him. Was he still out there on the streets, or had he managed to find his way back to something better? In those moments when everything seemed hopeless, the memory of that small act of kindness was the only thing that offered her any comfort. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder that, even when she felt powerless, she still had the capacity to help someone else. Tommy's transformation over the years was one of the hardest things for Annabeth to bear. He used to laugh so easily, filling their home with his joy, but now his smiles were rare, his laughter almost forgotten. His questions about their situation had changed too. At first, they were the innocent questions of a child. "Why do we have to leave, Mom?" Or, "When are we going back home?" Now they were laced with a deeper concern, questions no child should have to ask. "Are we going to be okay?" he asked one night, his voice small in the dark room. Annabeth's heart clenched in her chest, but she forced a smile, brushing his hair from his forehead. "We will, Tommy," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. As the days passed, Annabeth found herself growing numb to the struggle. She went through the motions, working, caring for Tommy, fighting to keep her head above water, but inside something had begun to break. She was tired of fighting a losing battle, tired of pretending to be strong when all she wanted to do was collapse under the weight of it all. Every night, as she tucked Tommy in, she whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep, telling him things would get better, that she would find a way. But the truth was, Annabeth didn't know how much longer she could keep going. And yet, despite everything, there was a small part of her that refused to give up completely. She had been through too much, survived too many hardships to let this defeat her. She remembered her mother's words from when she was young. Sometimes, all you can do is keep moving forward, even if you don't know where you're headed. And so, that's what Annabeth did. Every day she got up, took care of Tommy, and faced whatever challenge came her way. It wasn't hope that kept her going, not anymore. It was sheer will, the determination to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. But as the days grew darker, the memory of that single act of kindness remained like a small flame inside her, flickering but never extinguished. The dull hum of the heater was the only sound filling the small, cluttered living room as Annabeth sat at the table, sorting through a growing stack of bills. Each envelope seemed heavier than the last, their cold demands for money she didn't have gnawing at her already frayed nerves. The gray light filtering in from the window matched her mood, dull and weighed down by the endless strain of trying to survive. She hadn't slept well in days, haunted by thoughts of foreclosure, of Tommy's worried face, of the life she no longer recognized. A sharp knock at the door shattered the quiet. Annabeth flinched, her heart racing at the sudden interruption. She wasn't expecting anyone, and anxiety quickly bubbled up inside her. Moving cautiously toward the door, she wiped her hands on her jeans, smoothing out the wrinkles as if that would somehow prepare her for whatever was on the other side. When she pulled the door open, she froze. A man stood there, tall, well-dressed, with an air of confidence that seemed foreign in the worn-down hallway of the temporary housing complex. "Annabeth?" he asked, his voice soft but steady, as if testing whether he was in the right place. There was something in the way he said her name, something that pulled at the edges of her memory, but she couldn't place him. He wasn't a face from her current life of struggle, that much was clear. The man standing before her wore a perfectly tailored suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes bright with purpose. "It's Jack," he added, his tone gentle yet insistent, as though waiting for her to piece it together. It hit her like a jolt. Jack, the man from the street corner, the homeless man she had given her last dollar to all those years ago. But the man standing in front of her now couldn't be him. He looked so different, clean, composed, successful. Annabeth blinked, struggling to reconcile the image in her head of the disheveled man she had met in passing with the polished figure before her. I don't understand," she stammered, the words catching in her throat. "Jack?" "Yes," he said, nodding with a small, knowing smile. "I never forgot you. You gave me your last dollar, and it changed everything for me." His voice, though still familiar, was stronger now, more confident. Annabeth felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of disbelief and something close to pride. She had never expected that small gesture to ripple through time like this. "I couldn't let that kindness go to waste," he continued, stepping a little closer, his eyes earnest. "It inspired me. I turned my life around because of you." The room seemed to tilt as Jack spoke. Annabeth's mind raced, trying to keep up with the words tumbling from his mouth. He explained how, after that fateful day, he had found the strength to get off the streets. It hadn't been easy, but he had worked his way up, starting with small jobs, saving every penny, and eventually starting his own business. His success had been hard-earned, but he credited her act of kindness as the spark that lit the fire. Annabeth could barely believe what she was hearing. How could a single dollar have made such an impact? And now here he was, years later, standing in front of her, offering a lifeline. "I want to help you," Jack said, his voice firm but full of compassion. "You helped me when you didn't have anything to give, and I want to return the favor. I've built a company now, and we're doing well. I have a job for you, good pay, benefits, everything you deserve, and a place to stay, too. You and Tommy." The mention of her son brought a lump to Annabeth's throat. For a moment, she couldn't speak. This felt like a dream, too good to be real, and yet Jack's sincerity was undeniable. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't used to being on the receiving end of generosity. It felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. Jack smiled softly, his eyes kind. "Because you saw me when no one else did. You didn't treat me like I was invisible, even when you were struggling yourself. That's something I'll never forget." Annabeth stood there, rooted to the spot, the weight of his words sinking in. The offer was overwhelming, a lifeline in the midst of her storm. But even as she absorbed the enormity of it, Jack's face grew more serious. "There's something else," he said, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "I need your help with something." Annabeth's brow furrowed. What could he possibly need from her? "It's my daughter," he continued, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I lost touch with her when I was homeless. I haven't seen her in years, and I need help reconnecting with her. I thought, maybe you could help me with that." Annabeth's heart squeezed in her chest. She understood what it meant to feel disconnected, to lose touch with those you loved. She looked at Jack, seeing the weight of his request hanging between them, and for the first time, she saw the man behind the suit, not the successful businessman, but the father who had lost something precious and was trying, against all odds, to find his way back. She didn't know what she could do, but in that moment, she knew one thing. Just as she had offered him a small act of kindness all those years ago, she would find a way to help again. The office was a far cry from the chaotic life Annabeth had known. It was sleek, modern, with polished floors that reflected the overhead lights and desks arranged in clean, orderly rows. The hum of printers and quiet conversations surrounded her, a stark contrast to the noisy, unpredictable jobs she had worked before. Annabeth sat stiffly at her desk, feeling like an outsider in a place where everyone seemed to know exactly what they were doing. She stared at her computer screen, trying to make sense of the complex reports in front of her, but the numbers blurred together, an incomprehensible jumble. She felt out of place. Jack had given her this opportunity, believing in her, even when she wasn't sure she believed in herself. But each time she made a mistake, whether it was sending an email to the wrong person or mismanaging a task, her confidence took a hit. The more she fumbled, the more she questioned whether she belonged here at all. "What am I doing?" she muttered under her breath during one particularly rough day, her head resting in her hands. The walls of the office felt like they were closing in on her. She wasn't like these people. They were professionals. She was just a struggling single mom, barely hanging on. The looming threat of losing her home made everything worse. The legal battles over her house dragged on, with every phone call to the bank ending in frustration. It felt like the foreclosure notices were written in stone, something she could do nothing to stop. Every day she returned from work, only to be reminded that no matter how hard she fought, the life she was trying to rebuild could still crumble beneath her. The weight of it all left her exhausted, both physically and mentally, and the stress began to bleed into her relationship with Tommy. Tommy was old enough to sense the change. He was used to having his mom around, someone who always made time for him despite their hardships. But now, Annabeth's new job consumed her. She came home late, frazzled and distant, barely able to keep up with the demands of her work. "Mom, can we talk?" Tommy asked one evening as she shuffled papers around the small kitchen table, too focused on her work to look up. His voice was tentative, carrying the weight of the growing distance between them. "Not now, Tommy," Annabeth responded, her voice sharper than she intended. She glanced up and saw the hurt flicker across his face before he turned and retreated to his room. Guilt flooded her instantly. She wanted to go after him, to explain that she was doing all of this for him, for their future. But the exhaustion held her back. The bond they had shared, the one thing that had always felt unbreakable, was fraying, and Annabeth didn't know how to fix it. At work, she tried to put on a brave face, but the pressure was unrelenting. Every time Jack checked in on her, offering a kind word or a reassuring smile, it only made her feel worse. She didn't want to disappoint him, not after everything he had done for her. But the fear of failure gnawed at her constantly. She could see the faces of her co-workers, the way they moved through the day with ease, while she struggled just to keep up. It was as if they were all speaking a language she didn't understand, and every misstep only reminded her how far she still had to go. Still, something inside Annabeth refused to let her quit. Maybe it was the memory of all the times she had managed to survive when the odds were against her. Or maybe it was the unshakable desire to give Tommy the life he deserved. She couldn't afford to let her self-doubt win. Late at night, after she had tucked Tommy into bed and the apartment had fallen quiet, Annabeth would sit at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen, determined to learn what she didn't know. She took online courses, watched tutorials, and asked questions at work, slowly piecing together the skills she lacked. It wasn't easy. The mistakes didn't stop overnight, and the stress still weighed heavily on her. But with each small victory, a report submitted on time, a task completed without error, Annabeth began to feel a flicker of hope. She wasn't there yet, but she was learning, growing into this new life that felt foreign but full of potential. And though her relationship with Tommy was strained, she held on to the belief that she could fix it, that this struggle would lead them to something better. Annabeth's resolve was tested daily, but giving up wasn't an option. She had come too far, fought too hard to let everything slip away now. She wasn't just doing this for herself, she was doing it for Tommy, for the future they both deserved. Even on the hardest days, when the fear and doubt threatened to overwhelm her, she reminded herself of the same thing she told Tommy. "We will make it through this. I promise." And somehow, despite everything, she believed it. Jack sat behind his desk, the leather chair creaking slightly as he leaned back, massaging his temples. His office, once a symbol of the life he had fought so hard to build, now felt like a cage. The quiet hum of his phone vibrating on the desk only added to the tension that had been building for weeks. Each day, it seemed like another problem surfaced. An unexpected expense, a contract falling through, a new financial strain. His business, the one thing that had pulled him out of homelessness, was showing cracks, and with it, his confidence was starting to crumble. His health wasn't making things any easier. The years he had spent living rough had left scars he couldn't ignore anymore. Lately, the exhaustion was bone deep, a constant ache in his body that even sleep couldn't seem to fix. His doctor had warned him about the long-term effects, but Jack had pushed through, ignoring the signs for as long as he could. Now, though, the fatigue weighed him down like a heavy blanket. Every morning was a struggle, not just to face the day, but to believe he could keep this life together. Annabeth could sense the change in him. They often spoke late in the afternoons, after the office had cleared out, the two of them alone in the quiet space. Jack wasn't the man she had met at her doorstep a few months ago. There was a tension in his eyes, a quiet desperation that made him seem far older than his years. "I don't know if I can keep this going," he admitted one evening, staring out the window at the city below. His voice was quiet, raw in a way that made Annabeth feel an uncomfortable knot in her chest. She had always seen Jack as strong, someone who had overcome so much. To hear him express doubt now felt like the ground was shifting beneath them both. "Don't talk like that," she urged, sitting across from him. "You've built something incredible, Jack. You can get through this. You've done it before." Her words were meant to reassure, but even as she said them, she could see the weight of the world pressing down on him. Jack sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "It's different this time, Annabeth. I'm not just trying to survive anymore. I've got people depending on me, employees, clients, Emily." Her name hung in the air between them, and Annabeth could see the deep pain etched across his face. His daughter, the one connection he hadn't been able to mend. Jack's need to find Emily had become more than just a goal. It was a growing fear, an obsession born out of guilt and love. "What if it's too late?" he asked softly, his eyes meeting Annabeth's. "What if I've ruined things for good? I keep telling myself that if I can just see her, if I can explain, maybe she'll forgive me. But what if I'm wrong? What if she doesn't even want to see me?" The vulnerability in his voice made Annabeth's heart ache. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You won't know until you try. You've come this far, Jack. Don't give up now." But she knew it wasn't that simple. Jack's fears were more than just about his daughter. They were about everything he had built, everything he had fought for. The business was struggling, his health was faltering, and now the prospect of losing Emily, or never reconnecting with her, felt like the final blow he might not recover from. Annabeth could see it in his eyes, the fear that his success had always been fragile, that it could slip through his fingers just as easily as it had come. For Jack, the stakes had never been higher. Every night as the office lights dimmed and the building grew quiet, he found himself consumed by thoughts of what could go wrong. The business felt like a house of cards, one wrong move away from collapse. His health, already precarious, seemed to worsen with each passing day. And Emily, His beautiful daughter, who had been lost to him for so long, remained out of reach, a distant hope he was terrified would never come to fruition. Annabeth sat at the kitchen table, late into the night, the soft glow of her laptop screen casting shadows across her tired face. The search for Emily had proven to be far more elusive than she expected. Each lead she followed seemed to end in a dead end, and every email or letter she sent out came back unanswered. Annabeth wasn't easily discouraged, but with each failure, she felt the weight of Jack's hope resting on her shoulders. She had promised to help him find his daughter, and now it felt like she was running out of options. Still, she wasn't ready to give up. The last known address she had tracked down was a small, modest apartment building on the other side of town. Annabeth had driven there one afternoon, her heart racing with a strange mixture of nerves and excitement. When she arrived, though, the door was answered by a stranger. Someone who had never heard of Emily, someone who had moved in months ago. It was another dead end, and the disappointment hit Annabeth hard as she stood on the stoop, staring at the building, trying to imagine where Emily could be. She had severed almost all ties with her past, leaving behind only fragments of a life Jack desperately wanted to reconnect with. "Have you heard anything yet?" Jack's voice was tentative when he asked her later that evening, the question hanging in the air between them. He didn't need to say how much it meant to him. It was in his eyes, the way they flickered with a mix of hope and fear. Annabeth shook her head, offering him a sympathetic smile. "Not yet, but I'm not giving up," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady to offer him some measure of reassurance. She could see the strain in Jack's expression, the way his shoulders slumped a little more with every passing day. He was holding on to the hope of finding Emily like a lifeline. The more Annabeth searched, the more determined she became. She spent hours poring over public records, old phone directories, and social media sites, hoping for even the smallest trace of Emily. It became an obsession of sorts, her own way of feeling like she could repay Jack for the opportunity he had given her. But each time a search led to nothing, Annabeth felt the pressure mounting. Jack had trusted her with something so personal, and the last thing she wanted was to fail him. Jack, meanwhile, seemed to be retreating into himself. Annabeth noticed the way his hands trembled more often now, the way he stared off into the distance, lost in his thoughts. He was slipping, slowly but surely, back into the despair she had seen in him when he first arrived at her door. "I don't know how much longer I can wait," he confessed to her one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a hollow look in his eyes, and for the first time, Annabeth truly feared that if they didn't find Emily soon, Jack might unravel completely. Annabeth redoubled her efforts, not just for Jack's sake, but for her own. She had come to care deeply for him, not just as her benefactor, but as someone who had become a friend. She couldn't bear to see him lose everything he had fought for, not when she knew how fragile his success still felt to him. But the deeper she dug, the more Emily seemed to slip through her fingers. There were no traces left, no breadcrumbs leading them to her. It was as if Emily had deliberately erased herself from the world, and Annabeth had no idea why. Despite the growing sense of failure, Annabeth refused to quit. She had come too far, and Jack's hope was too important to let go. Every night as she sat in front of her computer or made another call to a dead end, she reminded herself that people could be found, that even the most lost connections could sometimes be restored. She just had to keep looking. But in the quiet moments when the house was still and her mind wandered, Annabeth couldn't help but wonder, what if Emily didn't want to be found? What if this entire search was a futile attempt to mend something that had already been broken beyond repair? Those doubts gnawed at her, but they only made her push harder. She wasn't ready to accept that yet, not when Jack's happiness was at stake. Annabeth sat across from Emily in a quiet cafe, the soft clinking of dishes and murmurs of conversation surrounding them. It had taken weeks to get to this moment, weeks of persistence, unanswered messages, and carefully worded letters. Emily finally agreed to meet, but as soon as Annabeth mentioned Jack, she could see Emily's body tense. The young woman, though outwardly calm, exuded a guardedness that Annabeth recognized instantly, the kind of self-protection born from years of pain. "Look," Emily said, her tone sharp, "I don't know why he sent you, but I'm not interested in reconnecting." Annabeth expected hostility, but hearing it cut through her still. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "He didn't send me," she replied gently. "Jack didn't know if you'd even want to hear from him. He just wants you to know that he's sorry. He's changed, Emily. He's trying to make things right." But as soon as the words left her mouth, Annabeth saw the flash of anger in Emily's eyes, a fire kindled from old, unresolved hurts. "Sorry?" Emily laughed bitterly, pushing her coffee cup away. "He's sorry? That's supposed to erase years of wondering where he was, why I wasn't good enough for him to stick around?" She shook her head, her voice dropping, filled with a quiet resentment. "I was a kid, Annabeth, a kid, and he left me. Do you know what it's like to go from one foster home to another, never feeling like you belong anywhere? He didn't just disappear from my life, he abandoned me. And I'm supposed to believe that some apology is going to fix all of that?" The rawness in Emily's words hit Annabeth like a wave. She had known Jack's absence had hurt his daughter, but she hadn't realized the full extent of the damage. The foster care system, the lack of stability, it explained so much of the hostility Emily carried. Annabeth leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but steady. "I'm not asking you to forgive him right away, or at all. I think you deserve to know that he's been trying to find you, to make amends. He's not perfect, Emily, but he's trying. And I think a part of you still wants to hear from him. Otherwise, you wouldn't have agreed to meet me today." For a moment, Emily said nothing. Her eyes dropped to her lap, her fingers tracing the edge of her napkin. Annabeth watched the internal battle play out in her expression. The part of Emily that still harbored a deep, justified anger, and the part that, perhaps, longed for the father she had lost. Just as the silence stretched, another voice cut through. "Emily, don't let her get into your head." A woman older than Emily had joined them, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "You've come too far to let him drag you back down." Annabeth immediately understood who this was, Emily's closest friend, the one who had been there during her darkest moments, the one reinforcing her decision to stay away. "He's only going to hurt you again," the woman insisted, her eyes hard as she glared at Annabeth. "People like him don't change. You don't owe him anything." Emily nodded slowly, her face hardening once more. "I don't know why I even came here," she muttered, standing up abruptly. This was a mistake. Annabeth's heart sank as she watched the walls go back up, reinforced by the very person who had been Emily's support system. The cafe felt too quiet, too small now, as Emily turned to leave. "Emily, wait!" Annabeth called out, standing but not following her. Emily stopped but didn't turn around. "You don't have to make any decisions now," Annabeth continued, her voice pleading. "Just think about it. Think about what you really want, not what anyone else tells you. If there's even the smallest part of you that wants to hear him out, don't close that door completely." Emily stood there for a beat, her back still to Annabeth, before walking away without another word. As Annabeth sank back into her chair, she felt defeated. Each conversation with Emily was a constant push and pull, hope flickering for a second before being snuffed out by old wounds. And now, the influence of Emily's friend added another layer of complexity to an already fragile situation. But as she replayed the look in Emily's eyes before she walked out, Annabeth couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a small part of her, however buried, that wanted to reconnect with Jack, that gave her just enough reason to keep trying. Annabeth drove through the darkened streets, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she neared the rundown motel. The call from Jack's assistant earlier had left her stomach in knots. He hadn't shown up at work, hadn't answered any of her calls, and now, here she was, at the kind of place she never thought Jack would find himself again. The neon sign of the motel flickered in and out, casting an eerie glow across the cracked pavement as Annabeth parked and hurried inside, her heart pounding in her chest. When she found Jack's room, her breath caught in her throat. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, she was met with the unmistakable smell of alcohol. Jack sat slumped at the small, dingy table, a nearly empty bottle of whiskey beside him. His face was haggard, his eyes glazed over as he stared into the distance, barely acknowledging her presence. "Jack?" Annabeth's voice wavered as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, clothes thrown carelessly, empty bottles littering the floor. This wasn't the Jack she knew. This was a man who had fallen back into the darkness he'd fought so hard to escape. "Annabeth!" Jack's voice was rough, barely more than a whisper. He didn't look at her, just continued staring at the floor. "I messed up." His words slurred together, and the sight of him like this, so broken, sent a jolt of pain through her. She had seen this before. Her own father had spiraled into alcoholism when life became too much. And now Jack, the man who had once stood so strong, was sitting in front of her, lost in the same haze of despair. "I can't do it anymore," Jack muttered, his hands trembling as they hovered over the bottle. "I thought I could fix things, but I'm losing everything again." Annabeth felt a surge of anger mixed with her deep concern. She grabbed the bottle off the table, her movements sharp, and slammed it down onto the counter. "Jack, look at me!" she demanded, her voice trembling but firm. He blinked up at her slowly, confusion and shame flickering in his eyes. "This isn't you. You've worked too hard to end up back here. You've survived worse than this, Jack. Don't you dare give up now." Her words were fierce, but beneath them, there was a rawness, a desperate plea for him to remember who he had become. Tears welled up in Jack's eyes as he shook his head, his voice cracking. "I tried, Annabeth. I tried to be better, but it's falling apart. Emily, she doesn't want anything to do with me. The business, it's collapsing. I'm losing it all again." His shoulders shook as he spoke, and Annabeth saw just how close he was to giving up. She knelt in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You're not losing everything," she said firmly. "You've already proven you're stronger than this. You've built a life, Jack. You have people who care about you. Emily might not be ready now, but that doesn't mean she never will be. And your business, we'll figure it out." For a long moment, Jack was silent, his breath ragged as he fought against the weight of his own despair. Annabeth held his gaze, refusing to let him slip further into the abyss. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, Jack leaned forward, resting his forehead against her shoulder, his body racked with quiet sobs. Annabeth's own heart broke for him, but she held him steady, whispering quietly, "You're not alone in this, Jack. I'm here. You don't have to do this by yourself." As the hours passed, Annabeth helped Jack clean up the room, pouring the remaining alcohol down the sink, silently hoping this moment wouldn't break him completely. Jack was quiet, exhausted, but he let her help, something he hadn't been able to do for himself. Eventually, she convinced him to leave the motel and come back to her apartment for the night. One step at a time, she reminded him as they left the dingy room behind, her arm wrapped around his shoulders. "You've beaten worse. You can do it again." The next morning was somber, but there was a shift in Jack's demeanor. He wasn't fixed. Annabeth knew that much. Recovery wasn't something that happened overnight, and this relapse was a painful reminder of how fragile it all could be. But Jack had fought his way back once before, and now, with Annabeth by his side, he began to pull himself together. "I'm sorry," Jack murmured as they sat in the quiet kitchen of her apartment, "for letting you down, for letting myself down." Annabeth shook her head gently, offering him a small smile. "You didn't let me down, Jack. You're still here. That's what matters." Annabeth sat across from Emily in their usual cafe, the late afternoon sun casting warm shadows through the window. They'd been meeting here for weeks now, the conversation between them growing more comfortable with each visit. At first, their talks were cautious, careful not to venture too deep into the past. But today felt different. There was something softer in Emily's expression, a subtle change in the way she looked at Annabeth. "Tell me more about him," Emily said quietly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Not the man he used to be, but who he is now." Annabeth's heart leapt at the question. This was the first time Emily had shown real curiosity about her father. Annabeth took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Jack's not the same person who left you," she began. "He's been through a lot. Losing everything forced him to rebuild from the ground up. He's not perfect, but he's spent years trying to make amends, not just for what happened with you, but for everything. He's worked hard to be someone he can live with." Emily's face remained unreadable, but Annabeth could see the wheels turning in her mind. "He still feels guilty, doesn't he?" Emily asked after a pause. Her voice wasn't accusatory, it was more reflective, as if she was starting to understand the weight Jack had been carrying. "He does," Annabeth confirmed. "But more than that, he regrets the time he lost with you. It eats at him every day, Emily. He knows he can't change the past, but he wants to make things right, as much as he can." There was a flicker of something in Emily's eyes. Sympathy, maybe, or a yearning for something she had buried long ago. Their conversation stretched on, and over time, Emily's defenses lowered, little by little. She started asking more about Jack, what he did in his day-to-day life, how he handled the struggles of his business, and how he had managed to stay sober despite the pressures surrounding him. Annabeth answered honestly, never sugarcoating Jack's past, but always emphasizing his commitment to change. "He's trying," Annabeth would say over and over. "He's not giving up on himself, and he's definitely not giving up on you." One day, after one of their quieter talks, Emily sighed deeply, as though releasing something she'd been holding on to for years. "Okay," she said almost to herself. "I'll write to him." Annabeth felt a surge of relief, but she kept her response calm. "I think that's a good idea," she said gently. "Just start slow. Say what you need to say, whatever that is." Emily nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Annabeth could see the conflict in her eyes, the war between anger and longing. The first letter Emily wrote was raw, filled with the pain and anger she had held on to for so long. Annabeth wasn't surprised. Emily had years of hurt to process, and she needed to get it out. When Jack received it, he read it in silence, his face pale as his eyes scanned the words. He didn't cry, but Annabeth could see the emotions swirling beneath the surface. "She's right to be angry," Jack said quietly, folding the letter carefully. "I deserve it." But even through the hurt, there was a spark of hope in his voice, a glimmer that hadn't been there before. The letters continued, each one a step forward. Slowly, the tone began to shift. Emily's words softened, though the tension between them remained. She asked about his life now, about his struggles, and how he had changed. Jack, in turn, opened up about his regrets, his fight to stay sober, and how he was learning to live with the man he had once been. Each exchange built a small bridge between them, fragile but real. Jack held onto those letters like lifelines, each one a reminder that he hadn't completely lost his chance with her. As the weeks went by, Jack and Emily's correspondence became more frequent, less awkward. There were still moments of anger, but they were tempered with glimpses of the bond they had once shared. Emily started to see Jack not just as the man who had abandoned her, but as someone who had changed, someone who was trying to be better. And for Jack, those letters were a lifeline, proof that he hadn't completely lost the chance to be part of his daughter's life again. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was a start, a fragile beginning that gave both Jack and Emily something they hadn't had in years: hope. The restaurant was small, intimate, with soft lighting and the low murmur of conversations filling the air. Annabeth had chosen it carefully, wanting to create a space that felt private but welcoming. She sat at a table near the back, glancing toward the door every few seconds. Jack had arrived early, his nerves clearly fraying as he fidgeted with the silverware, his eyes darting around the room as if unsure what to expect. Annabeth placed a hand on his, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "She'll come," she said softly, though she could feel the tension radiating off him. The door swung open, and there she was, Emily. Her face was unreadable as she stepped inside, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Jack. Annabeth saw the flicker of emotion in both their eyes, years of hurt, regret, and something more, something fragile and hopeful. Emily walked over slowly, each step filled with the weight of the past. Jack stood up, his hands trembling slightly, unsure whether to reach out or stay still. "Hi, Dad," Emily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time Annabeth had heard her call him that. "Emily!" Jack's voice cracked, filled with the kind of emotion that couldn't be expressed in words. He gestured to the seat across from him, and they both sat down, the table between them feeling like a chasm, yet a bridge all at once. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. Annabeth stayed in the background, not wanting to intrude but ready if either of them needed her. Finally, Jack broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw, each word carrying the weight of his regret. "I know I've said it in the letters, but it doesn't feel like enough. I'm sorry for everything. For leaving. For the years you had to face alone. For the pain I caused. I wish I could go back and change it all. But I can't." His eyes, red and glossy, never left hers, desperate for some sign that she understood, that she might one day forgive him. Emily's expression remained guarded, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said after a pause, her voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "But I'm willing to try. I don't want to be angry anymore. I don't want to carry it with me for the rest of my life. But you have to understand, it's not going to be easy. It's going to take time." Her honesty cut through the air like a blade, and Jack nodded, his expression one of deep understanding. "I know," Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not expecting anything to happen overnight. I just want a chance to be in your life again. However you'll let me. I want to earn that." Emily nodded slowly, her walls still up but starting to crack. The conversation shifted from apologies to memories, painful ones at first, but then, slowly, they began to talk about lighter things, what Emily had been doing with her life, Jack's attempts to rebuild his. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Hours passed and the tension eased, though it never fully disappeared. But by the time they left the restaurant, something had changed. Jack and Emily walked out together, still tentative, but there was hope. Annabeth followed behind them, a quiet witness to the first steps of their reconciliation. She watched as they said their goodbyes, a hug that was both awkward and meaningful, a sign that the road ahead, while long, was one they were both willing to walk. For Annabeth, the reunion was bittersweet. She had been the bridge that connected them, but now they had to do the rest on their own. It felt good, though, to know she had helped. It reminded her that people, no matter how broken, could find their way back to one another. And that realization sparked something in her. She realized that her own journey wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about helping others rebuild, just as she had helped Jack and Emily. In the months that followed, Annabeth continued her work at Jack's company, but with a new purpose. She started projects aimed at helping those who were struggling, people who had fallen on hard times and needed a second chance. It wasn't just about a paycheck anymore. It was about giving people hope, just as Jack had given her when he showed up at her door. Tommy, too, thrived in this new chapter of their lives. Their relationship, once strained by the chaos and uncertainty, had found a new balance, rooted in stability and the promise of better days. As Annabeth watched Jack and Emily slowly rebuild their relationship, she couldn't help but feel proud, not just of them, but of herself. She had helped mend a family, one that had been torn apart by years of pain, and in doing so, had transformed her own life in ways she hadn't expected. There was still work to be done, challenges ahead for all of them, but for the first time in a long time, the future felt open, full of possibilities. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.